Hi, it's Dr. Cullen from Reagan Street Institute and the Pima County Health Department. And today I'm going to talk with you about Section 2 for OpenHIE, the Introduction to Health Data Standards. So let me get my screen being shared here, and we should be able to take off. And you can look at my screen and we can watch. There we go, Introduction to Health Data Standards. So let me start. Upon completion of this section, you'll have a foundational understanding of what data needs to move between systems, how data standard flow works, value of the health data standard, and organizational responsible for data standards. So what does data need to move between? As we know, data moves between people and health systems, and it does that through different processes and the use of different technology. It's really the health system challenge that we know from a user-centered design, human-centered design perspective. People, process, technology, and what we're going to talk about here today is what's happening in the technology and what do data standards bring to that. So what's the value of health data standards? What do they bring for us? Well, they do multiple things, and we're going to talk about these 6 different areas, but the first thing I really want to talk about is safe and effective clinical care. The ability to record data and information at the point of care in a standard way is really critical. And you can think of an example here of recording blood pressure data in electronic health records. There's 2 numbers, a top number and a bottom number is what we refer to them as. The top number is systolic, the bottom number is diastolic, and there's values for each of those numbers. Obviously, there's acceptable values, which are what we normally see clinically. So it would be rare on a diastolic value to have a value less than 40, because that would probably mean somebody is fairly ill. So what we see by using the health data standard is we have a standard that defines what a systolic blood pressure can be called, what a diastolic blood pressure can be called, and helps us fill in the data fields with acceptable values. The next slide talks about the longitudinal care record. This is our ability to share data and information across the lifespan of a patient. This is really critical. If we think of blood pressure and we think of someone who may develop what we call hypertension, which is high blood pressure, they need to have a historical record of what their normal systolic, the top number, and their normal diastolic, the bottom number are, where the data was obtained, and what are the values that were in there. This allows us to graph blood pressure over time. What that means is that we can really determine when somebody became hypertensive, what their numbers were when they were hypertensive. There's different classifications of hypertension, and enables us to make sure that we're treating them effectively. The next slide talks about data quality and the need to compare apples to apples and not oranges. That means the top number, the systolic number, needs to be compared to systolic numbers. If you compare it to the bottom number, you could end up not understanding what's happening in the patient and or their care. By having this data quality, the comparison of systolic to systolic blood pressure in this case, we are able to track longitudinally what happens with a patient and whether there has been consistency in their blood pressure. That's really important from a clinical perspective. Then interoperability between systems. We know this is critical. This is how we share data between systems. How do we know that what you're recording in one record is the same as what's being recorded in another record? So the health data standard allows us and facilitates this consistency and longitudinal tracking. It also allows us to share granular data, that's like the specific data, so that we can make sure it's the same between them. Report aggregation and evaluation is really important. This allows us to pull blood pressures from multiple, in this case, different populations together to say how many of people in that population have blood pressure control, how many don't, and to follow that over time. You know, there's a real commitment these days to make sure that non-communicable diseases get in better control in low and middle income countries. Interoperability between systems facilitates the report aggregation and evaluation. The report aggregation and evaluation is one way we start being able to see what is the element of blood pressure control in a community and what has happened over time. Finally, we have analytics and business intelligence in a data warehouse. This is a topic that people have been talking about for decades, how critical it is that we have a place where we can pull data together and we can do an analytics and evaluation of that data from a business intelligence. It allows us to data mine and provide research, and it also allows us to look at things like clinical quality, the amount of care that's being given to a population. How do we know that what's happening in one population is consistent with what we're looking at in another population? So because the standards allow us to do apples to apples, it allows and supports the ability for there to be a data warehouse. Now, what's the technical infrastructure? You've seen this slide, and you'll see it multiple times through the OpenHIE training, where we have this national health architecture bit, which is based on principles. You can see those principles listed here. What we know is that we need to build on infrastructure. That infrastructure now really needs to incorporate standards, that we need to include the ability to monitor and evaluate and enhance that model. Enhance the model means that we can extend it. If there's new standards that come across, we'll be able to implement those, and that it can be technology independent. Standards allow us to be technology independent because the standards are independent, and we can use them independent of the technology. So who's responsible for health data standards? Lots of different organizations. Many of these hopefully you're familiar with, the WHO, ICD-10 and 11 used really ubiquitously in lots of different places. ISO just provides additional standards. HL7 is primarily a messaging standard, and we'll talk about that in a next trainings. But when you think of HL7, you can think of HL7 version 2 and version 3, version 2.2, version 3.0, and then FHIR. And many of you have probably heard of FHIR. FHIR is another messaging standard that is supported under the auspices of HL7. Regenstrief Institute, where I'm an affiliate scientist, is responsible for LOINC. LOINC is an open source standard primarily for labs, so it also includes vital signs and questions. It also includes notes and the titles of notes. So when you're searching in an electronic medical record for, did someone have a preoperative evaluation, there would be a specific LOINC code for that, which would make it easier for you to find. Finally, SNOMED, which many of you have heard of. SNOMED is the systematized nomenclature of medicine, and that provides a lot of clinical terms that we use in terms of SNOMED CT. Types of standards, semantic and syntactic. Semantic provides specific words and codes. These are the ones you're probably most familiar with. ICD-10, diabetes type 2, medications, penicillin, lab test, finger stick glucose. They would all have specific codes associated with them. They would be things using ICD-10, SNOMED, or LOINC. So all of these combined are standards, and you can see from a clinical perspective how critical they are, and that how we would use them as we move forward with clinical care and trying to standardize data across organizations. So to get interoperability, standards become really important. Syntactic are messaging standards. We talked a little bit about that with HL7 and FHIR, and there'll be a lot more to learn about that. This is Dr. Cullen then bringing you this information about data standards and how to use them. And we will stop sharing and stop recording. I hope this was helpful.